1227. The banks of the Yellow River. The air is thick, not with the familiar scent of steppe grass and horse sweat, but with the alien odor of dust, death, and decay. It is the smell of a civilization being ground into powder. Inside a felt yurt, far more ornate than the one he was born in, yet somehow colder, an old man lies dying. The sensory assault is relentless. He feels the penetrating chill of his own mortality, a cold deeper than any Siberian winter, seeping into his bones. His ears, once attuned to the whistle of an arrow from 1,000 paces, now hear only the phantom screams from the sacked Tangut capital of Ningxia, the death rattle of a kingdom he has just erased. He sees the faces of the dead in the flickering oil lamp, the arrogant Shah of Khwarezm, the defiant Jin generals, his own blood brother Jamukha. His world has shrunk from the endless horizon of the steppe to the suffocating confines. Of this tent, his body, which once held the strength of a wolf, is now a cage of pain. This is the end for the master of half the world. The conqueror of 100 kings is being conquered by a fever, a mundane, ignominious fall from a horse. The irony is as sharp as the winter wind. He who commanded 1,000,000 warriors, whose name made emperors in their gilded palaces tremble, is now helpless. His gaze drifts towards the yurt's opening, seeing not the camp of his invincible army, but a distant, wind-swept hill from a lifetime ago. He is a boy again, alone, hunted, with nothing but a stolen marmot for his starving family. The journey from that desperate boy to this dying god is the most impossible epic ever lived. To understand the man who lies here, broken by age but still burning with the memory of a world in flames, we must understand the paradox that defines him. He was the great unifier and the great destroyer, the lawgiver and the mass murderer, the man who connected East and West with a road of bones. This is the story of him. This is the saga of the man they called Genghis Khan. This is the narrative of him, the outcast who became a god, the shepherd who became master of a world far larger than any his ancestors could have imagined. But the core question, the central dramatic paradox that echoes from the ashes of Ningxia back to the frozen plains of his youth, remains staggeringly simple and profound. How? How does a boy named Temujin, a child with no status, no army, and no future, abandoned by his own people and left to die on the merciless steppe, rise to command the greatest and most terrifying land empire in human history? What force of will, what unique alchemy of circumstance, cruelty, and genius allowed this singular man to claw his way out of utter nothingness and impose his vision on all of humanity from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Europe? To answer this, we cannot begin with the emperor in his tent of gold brocade. We must return to the world that spawned him. A world of utter chaos, a world that needed to be broken before it could be remade. His story is not merely one of conquest, but of the systematic deconstruction and reconstruction of power itself. He did not simply defeat his enemies. He rewrote the very laws of survival, of loyalty, and of war. He transformed the petty squabbles of nomads into a global historical force, a storm that swept out of the East and permanently altered the trajectory of civilization. The answer to how lies not in a single battle or a stroke of luck, but in a long, brutal, and calculated ascent from the absolute bottom, where every humiliation became a lesson, every betrayal a sharpening of the will, and every act of violence a necessary step towards an unshakable, terrifying, and divinely ordained destiny. His life is the ultimate testament to the idea that history is not made by abstract forces, but by the indomitable and often monstrous will of a single individual. To understand this man, we must return to the world of his birth, the brutal chessboard of the 12th century Eurasian steppe. This was not a unified nation, but a cauldron of ceaseless, fluid warfare, a patchwork quilt of blood feuds sewn together with treachery and desperation. Imagine a vast, unforgiving sea of grass, where life was as harsh and ephemeral as a summer storm. Upon this sea sailed the nomadic tribes, each a universe unto itself, bound by intricate codes of honor and instantaneous, lethal violence. To the east were the Tatars, the ancient enemies of the Mongols, feared for their savagery and their rumored use of poison. To the west, the Naimans, more sophisticated, touched by the Nestorian Christianity of the Silk Road, yet just as ambitious. And in the center, the Merkits, the Karaits, the Taichiuds, a dizzying constellation of clans and confederations, constantly shifting their alliances, their entire existence, a perpetual struggle for pasture, for horses, for women, for survival. This was the micro level, a world of close-up, personal vendettas where the murder of a chieftain could trigger generations of warfare. But zooming out, to the mid-level, these tribes were not acting in a vacuum. They were all pawns in a much larger game, manipulated by the colossal, sophisticated, and decaying empires that bordered their world. To the south lay the Jin dynasty, the Golden Kings of northern China. From their magnificent capital at Zhongdu, they viewed the steppe nomads as barbarians to be managed, deliberately playing one tribe against another, inciting wars and buying loyalty to keep the wild dogs weak and divided. And far to the west, beyond the great deserts, lay the powerful Khwarezmian Empire, a Persianate Turkic sultanate that controlled the richest cities of the Silk Road, Samarkand, Bukhara, Urgench, a world of astronomers, poets, and immense wealth, utterly oblivious to the storm gathering on its eastern frontier. This was Temujin's world, a place of absolute insecurity, where a man's only protection was his clan, and a clan's only certainty was its enemies. It was a world perfectly designed to crush any spark of unity, a perpetual motion machine of violence. It was into this forge of chaos that the boy who would burn the world was born. His origin was not one of glory, but of profound and searing humiliation, an ancestral curse that would fuel a lifetime of rage. This is the saga of his forging. He was born Temujin, the son of Yasugai, a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan, a man of some repute, but by no means a great power on the steppe. The legend, as later chronicled, says he was born clutching a clot of blood in his right fist, a portent of the future, a sign from the eternal sky, Tengri. But his early life was defined not by divine signs, but by human treachery. When Temujin was only 9 years old, his father Yasugai was murdered, poisoned by Tatar rivals, while sharing a meal under the guise of hospitality. This act was not merely a personal tragedy. It was a political death sentence for his entire family. In the ruthless world of the steppe, a clan without a strong male leader was a liability, a mouth to feed with no sword to defend it. The Taichiud clan, rivals to his own, seized the opportunity. Led by Targutai Kiriltuk, they performed the ultimate act of contempt. They abandoned Yasugai's 2 widows and 7 young children, leaving them to die on the open steppe. The sensory assault of this moment is the key to his entire psychology. Imagine the sounds, the derisive laughter of the departing tribesmen, the cries of his mother, Hoelun, the terrible vast silence of the plains that followed. Imagine the smells, the dust kicked up by the departing horses, the scent of fear and despair. Imagine the cold, the gnawing hunger that became a constant companion. This was his first lesson. Loyalty is a luxury, and power is the only truth. He was no longer the son of a chief, he was human refuse. This crucible forged his character. He learned to hunt, to scavenge, to survive. It was during this time that he committed his first murder, killing his own half-brother, Begter, in a cold-blooded dispute over a fish. It was not an act of rage, but of calculation. Begter was older, stronger, and a threat to his own nascent authority within the starving family. His arrow was a declaration. In the game of survival, he would make the rules. He was captured by the Taichiuds, locked in a wooden kangue, a walking symbol of humiliation. But even in chains, his mind was working, observing, learning. He escaped, hiding in a river with only his nose above the water, aided by a sympathetic stranger who saw a flicker of greatness in the desperate boy. This was the forging of Genghis Khan, a process of being stripped of everything: status, family, freedom, dignity, until nothing remained but a core of unbreakable, diamond-hard will. The first step from the darkness of survival into the great game of steppe politics was not a grand battle or a bold declaration, but a desperate act born of love and shame. This was the saga of his arrival. After his escape and years of living on the fringe, Temujin managed to reclaim a semblance of life. He found and married Borta, the woman to whom he had been betrothed as a child, a union that brought with it a precious dowry, a magnificent sable coat. For a man with nothing, this coat was everything. It was not wealth, it was a token of legitimacy, his sole political asset, and he knew exactly how to use it. The catalyst for his entry onto the world stage was a catastrophe, a surprise raid by the rival Merkit tribe. They came at dawn, a thunder of hooves and savage cries, seeking revenge for a wrong committed a generation earlier when Temujin's mother, Hokalun, had been stolen by his father from a Merkit chief. They took everything, but their true prize was Berta. The abduction of his wife was the ultimate dishonor, a public declaration of his impotence. The sensory assault of that moment was one of utter helplessness. The sound of his wife's screams fading into the distance, the smell of the raiders' horses, the chilling realization that he was once again the boy abandoned on the steppe. But this time, something was different. The humiliation did not break him. It focused him. He knew he could not rescue Borta alone. He needed an army. It was here that he made the most important journey of his young life, not to war, but to the camp of the most powerful man he knew, Togrul Khan, leader of the Karayat tribe, and, crucially, the sworn brother, the Anda, of his murdered father. He approached the great Khan not as a warrior, but as a supplicant. He presented his only treasure, the sable coat, as a gift. The gesture was a masterpiece of political theater. It was a reminder of old debts, a claim on the sacred bond of brotherhood that tied Togrul to his dead father. He was not begging. He was strategically reviving a forgotten alliance. Togrul, perhaps moved by the memory of his friend, or perhaps seeing a useful pawn in this determined young man, accepted. He agreed to help, to lend his armies. In that moment, Temujin the outcast ceased to exist. He had entered the great game, not as a player, but as a piece on the board. But he had learned the most vital lesson of power. It is not something you are born with, but something you take, using whatever tools you have, even if all you have is a memory and a coat of fur. Behind every great ambition lies an inner demon, a secret motivation that is the true engine of a historic destiny. For Temujin, it was not merely a desire for revenge or a lust for riches. It was a profound and terrifying obsession with order, born from the psychological trauma of his youth. This was the saga of his hidden fear. To understand Genghis Khan, one must understand the gnawing, existential dread of chaos that was branded into his soul as a child. The world he knew was arbitrary, violent, and utterly without law. Alliances were meaningless, promises were broken, and life was subject to the whim of the strongest. The abandonment by his clan, the murder of his father, the abduction of his wife, these were not just isolated events. They were symptoms of a diseased world, a world without a center, without a supreme authority to enforce justice. His inner demon was the memory of his own powerlessness, the feeling of being a leaf in a storm. His entire life's work would become a declaration of war against that storm. This is the key to the paradox of the lawgiver and the destroyer. He destroyed existing orders, the Jin dynasty, the Khwarezmian Empire, because he saw them as corrupt, weak, and ultimately part of the chaos. He slaughtered millions with a chilling detachment, not out of simple bloodlust, but because he believed any resistance to his unification was a sin against the divine order he was destined to create. This obsession was given a divine framework through his profound connection to Tengri, the eternal blue sky, the supreme deity of the steppe. He came to believe, with messianic fervor, that he was not just a conqueror, but a divine instrument, an avatar of Tengri's will sent to punish the wicked and bring all the peoples of the world under the peace of a single, unchallengeable law. This was not political propaganda. It appears to have been a deeply held conviction. This belief gave him an unshakable self-confidence. How could he lose a battle when he was commanded by heaven itself? This secret motivation explains both his genius and his monstrosity. It drove him to create the Yassa, his great legal code, which brutally punished theft, adultery, and treason, imposing a rigid, predictable order on the formerly lawless steppe. It also drove him to unleash horrors unprecedented in their scale, justifying the extermination of entire populations as a necessary, cleansing act. The man who conquered the world was, at his core, forever the frightened boy on the steppe, desperately trying to build a fortress of absolute order so that he and the world would never have to feel that helpless again. In the epic of any great man, there is a fateful encounter, a relationship that defines his path, acting as both a catalyst and a crucible. For Temujin, that figure was Jamuka. This was the saga of the blood brothers, the two poles of the Mongol soul. Their relationship was more than a mere alliance or rivalry. It was the central drama of the unification of the steppe, a clash of personalities and philosophies that would shape a nation. They met as boys in the brief period of stability after Temujin's father's death and became Anda, sworn blood brothers, exchanging gifts and pledging eternal loyalty in a sacred ritual. Jamuka was everything Temujin was not. He was from a high-ranking, aristocratic lineage, effortlessly charismatic, a natural leader who attracted followers with his charm and noble bearing. Temujin was the opposite, an outcast, intense, brooding, a leader who earned loyalty through sheer force of will and a demonstrated genius for survival. In the early days, after the successful rescue of Burta, a campaign they undertook together with Togrul Khan, they were inseparable. They ruled their joined followers together, a partnership of aristocratic grace and meritocratic grit. But this idyllic brotherhood contained the seeds of its own destruction. Their fundamental views of the world were irreconcilable. Jamuka represented the old way of the steppe, a world governed by tradition, noble bloodlines, and aristocratic privilege. He believed power was a birthright. Temujin, forged in the fires of humiliation, believed the opposite. He had seen the corruption and weakness of the aristocracy firsthand. He championed a radical new idea: meritocracy. He promoted men based on skill and loyalty, not their lineage. A shepherd could become a general in his army if he was brave and capable. A nobleman's son could be executed if he was a coward. This philosophical chasm inevitably cracked open their brotherhood. The final break came over a seemingly trivial matter, a dispute over where to camp. But it was really the culmination of their diverging paths. They separated, and the people of the steppe had to choose. The aristocrats and traditionalists flocked to Jamukha. The outcasts, the dispossessed, the ambitious commoners, they chose Temujin. The stage was set for a civil war, a battle not just for control of the Mongol tribes, but for the very idea of what the Mongol nation would become. Their personal tragedy was that in order to build his new world, Temujin would have to destroy the only man who had ever truly been his equal, his brother, his shadow. The ascent to absolute power is a staircase paved with compromise, calculation, and blood. Having broken with his past and his only brother, Temujin began the grim and methodical process of forging a power base. This was the saga of the price of power, a series of brutal lessons in statecraft. His first act as an independent leader was to welcome the followers who had chosen him, not as a traditional chieftain, but as the master of a new kind of organization. While Jamukha's camp was a loose confederation of nobles, Temujin's was a tightly disciplined proto-state, built on a single, terrifying principle: absolute loyalty to him alone. He understood that to build something new, he first had to shatter the old structures of kinship and clan that had kept the steppe in a state of perpetual warfare. He began to organize his followers into units of 10, 100, and 1,000, deliberately mixing members of different clans and tribes. A man's loyalty was no longer to his cousin or his chieftain. It was to his decimal commander, and ultimately to Temujin. This was a revolutionary act, a direct assault on the foundations of nomadic society. But this new order had to be consecrated in blood. The first test came from within his own extended family, the Jurchen clan. During a celebratory feast, they instigated a brawl, insulted his authority, and then abandoned his next military campaign. For Temujin, this was not just an insult, it was treason. His response was swift and utterly ruthless. After defeating his external enemies, he turned on the Jurchens, executing their leaders and enslaving their people. The message was unmistakable and chilling. No bond, not even blood, was higher than the bond of loyalty to the future Khan. He was teaching the steppe a new and terrible political mathematics. The second price of power was the systematic destruction of his rivals, but with a calculated twist. When he defeated the Tatars, the tribe that had poisoned his father, he did not simply scatter them. He issued a horrific order. Every Tatar male taller than a cart's linchpin was to be executed. He was not just taking revenge, he was committing an act of political genocide, erasing a rival power from existence and absorbing their women and children into his own growing nation. He was demonstrating that his enemies would not just be defeated, they would be unmade. It was through these acts of brutal consolidation that Temujin began to accumulate the human and material resources needed for his grand project, demonstrating to all that the price for opposing him was oblivion, but the prize for following him was a share in a world-conquering destiny. Every rising hero is defined by the great antagonist they must overcome. For the fledgling Mongol nation, that antagonist was not a single man or a rival tribe, but a colossal, ancient, and arrogant civilization, the Jurchen Jin dynasty. This was the saga of the wolf against the dragon. The Jin, or Golden Kings, were a formidable power that ruled over northern China and Manchuria. They were everything the Mongols were not: sedentary, literate, urbanized, and possessed of immense wealth and a sophisticated state bureaucracy. From their magnificent capital at Zhongdu, near modern-day Beijing, a city of 1 million souls with walls 40 feet high, they looked out upon the steppe with a mixture of fear and contempt. For centuries, their core foreign policy had been yi, yi, ji, yi, using barbarians to control barbarians. They were master manipulators, skillfully fomenting rivalries between the steppe tribes, bestowing titles and silks on favored chieftains, while secretly plotting the downfall of any who grew too powerful. They had, in fact, played a role in the death of one of Temujin's ancestors, Genghis Khan, who was betrayed to the Jin and executed by being nailed to a wooden donkey. For Temujin, therefore, the Jin were not just a geopolitical obstacle. They were a symbol of national humiliation, the architects of his people's division and suffering. Conquering the Jin was the ultimate test of his new nation and his divine mandate. It was an undertaking that seemed, to any rational observer, to be pure insanity. How could a nomadic army, no matter how disciplined, hope to defeat a state with a census in the tens of millions, a massive infantry army, and the most advanced siege technology in the world? The Mongols had no experience in capturing fortified cities. Their entire way of life was built on the mobility of the open plain. The Jin represented the fundamental conflict between the nomadic world and the settled world, between the raw energy of the steppe and the entrenched power of civilization. To defeat them would require not just courage, but a complete reinvention of Mongol warfare. The wolf would have to learn the dragon's tricks: how to starve cities, how to build siege engines, how to administer conquered lands. The coming war would be more than a war of conquest. It would be an existential struggle that would transform the Mongols from a steppe horde into a global empire, and its leader from a tribal chieftain into a true emperor of all men. Even a man touched by destiny must face the crucible of defeat. The path to becoming Genghis Khan was not an unbroken series of victories. It was punctuated by a catastrophic failure that nearly ended his story before it had truly begun. This was the saga of his breaking point. After the initial split with Yamuka, both men began to consolidate their power, and a final confrontation became inevitable. The two forces, representing the old aristocratic order and the new meritocratic one, met at a place called Dalan Baljut. Temujin was outnumbered. Yamuka had marshaled a larger coalition of traditionalist clans who feared Temujin's radical reforms. The battle was a disaster. The sensory assault was one of chaos and collapse, the sight of his own battle lines breaking, the sound of his warriors screaming in retreat, the bitter taste of dust and defeat. Temujin's forces were routed. He was forced to flee and hide, once again becoming a fugitive, the man on the run. But it was the aftermath of the battle that served as his true psychological breaking point. In victory, Yamuka revealed the core of his philosophy, and it was a vision of cruelty rooted in aristocratic arrogance. He had 70 young chieftains, from a clan allied with Temujin, boiled alive in great cauldrons. The act was meant to be a terrifying display of power, a traditional punishment to cow his enemies. But it backfired spectacularly. The sheer horror of the act, its wanton cruelty, disgusted many of the neutral clans. They saw in Yamuka not a noble leader, but a vicious tyrant. Temujin, in hiding, learned the most valuable lesson of his life. He understood that his defeat was not just military, but ideological. He had tried to fight the old game with a slightly new set of rules. Now he knew he had to throw the whole game board away. The humiliation of Dalan Baljut forged in him an iron resolve. He would never again be outmaneuvered. He would never again trust in the fickle loyalties of the old clan system. He would build his power base not on coalitions, but on a fanatically loyal core of sworn companions, the Nokhord, who were bound to him personally, transcending clan and family. The defeat taught him that true power did not come from having the most allies, but from having the most disciplined and completely loyal followers. The man who emerged from the wilderness after this crushing failure was colder, harder, and infinitely more dangerous. He now understood that to build his new world, he had to be more ruthless and more visionary than any of his rivals could ever imagine. Chaos is a ladder, and for a master political strategist, the turmoil of his enemies is the greatest opportunity. While the established powers of the steppe were consumed by their ancient feuds and petty ambitions, Temujin, the supposed loser of Dalan Balzut, began a patient and methodical comeback. This was the saga of his rise from the ashes. He did not immediately seek a grand rematch with Jamuka. Instead, he vanished into the wilderness, a ghost on the political landscape, and began to rebuild his strength from the ground up, applying the brutal lessons of his defeat. His primary instrument was the Nokhord, the brotherhood of sworn companions. This was his masterstroke, a political and military innovation that shattered the old steppe order. These were men who had abandoned their clans to follow him, men like the heroic archer Jebe or the calculating general Subutai. Their loyalty was not to a tribe, but to a man and his vision. He became their clan, their family, their god. While Jamuka ruled through fear and tradition, Temujin built a core of devoted fanatics, a human weapon that was disciplined, adaptable, and utterly loyal. With this new force, he began to exploit the chaos around him. He did not attack his strongest enemies first. He waited. He watched. He used the internal conflicts of others as his weapon. When his old protector Togrul Khan of the Karaites got into a succession dispute with his own family, Temujin intervened, not as a subordinate, but as a kingmaker, restoring Togrul to power, and in doing so, making the most powerful man on the steppe indebted to him. He used the arrogance of the Tatars against them, forging a temporary alliance with the Jin dynasty, his ultimate enemy, to crush the tribe that had murdered his father, taking his revenge and seizing their vast pastures and manpower in a single, brilliant campaign. He operated like a master predator, picking off the weakest members of the herd, circling his larger prey and always growing stronger. He turned the steppe's chaos into a weapon. Where others saw a dizzying array of threats, he saw a chessboard of opportunities. Each minor victory brought him more followers, more horses, more resources. The man who had been a fugitive was quietly, systematically, becoming the single gravitational center of the Mongol world, pulling all the scattered pieces of his nation towards him with an irresistible force. There comes a moment when a leader ceases to be a man and becomes a symbol, an incarnation of a people's destiny. For Temujin, that moment of transfiguration was the Great Kurultai of 1206. This was the saga of his coronation, the culmination of 2 decades of bloodshed, betrayal, and relentless ambition. Imagine the scene. On the banks of the Onan River, at the source of the sacred headwaters, a vast city of white yurts bloomed on the plain. A nation had gathered. The sensory assault was overwhelming. The sound was a low, constant hum of 1,000,000 animals and hundreds of thousands of people. The thunder of countless hooves as messengers arrived, the bleating of sheep for the great feasts, the murmur of 100 different dialects now united under one banner. The sight was a sea of humanity, a forest of clan standards and horsetail banners, the tugs flickering in the wind. The smell was of roasting meat, horse sweat, and the crisp, clean air of the Mongolian heartland. All the tribes were there, the Karaites and Naimans, no longer rivals, but subjects. The Tatars and Merkits, no longer enemies, but slaves absorbed into the new order. They had all been brought to heel, their leaders executed, their power structures dismantled and reassembled under his command. Here, in the presence of the entire nation, he had forged in fire and blood. The final ceremony took place. The great shaman, Kokuchu Teb Tengri, a figure of immense spiritual power, stepped forward. In a voice that carried across the assembled multitude, he delivered the verdict of the heavens. He declared that Temujin was the chosen representative of the eternal blue sky, Tengri. He bestowed upon him a new name, a title of supreme and universal power. Genghis Khan, the oceanic ruler, the universal sovereign. In that moment, Temujin, the son of Yasuge, the outcast, the fugitive, ceased to exist. A new entity was born. He was no longer just a Khan among Khans. He was the sole, divinely ordained ruler of all the peoples of the felt-walled tents. The shepherd was now the undisputed king of the most disciplined, battle-hardened, and terrifying army the world had ever seen. The unification of Mongolia was complete, but this was not an end. It was the beginning. The awesome military machine he had created could not sit idle. It needed a purpose, a direction. And from the sacred mountain, Genghis Khan now looked south, towards the ancient, wealthy, and unsuspecting empire of the Jin. The storm was about to break upon the world. To be raised from nothing to the pinnacle of absolute power is to undergo a profound psychological transformation. At the Kurultai, standing before his unified nation, Genghis Khan was no longer just a man. He had become a living god, the physical embodiment of a divine mission. This was the saga of his hubris, a moment of supreme self-realization that would steer the course of his conquests. As he stood atop the sacred mountain, communing with the eternal sky, his perception of himself and his purpose crystallized. The boy who had fought for survival was gone. The chieftain who had fought for revenge was gone. In his place stood a figure who saw himself as a necessary, cosmic force. He was not a conqueror in his own mind. He was a divine instrument, a scourge of God, sent to punish the decadent, corrupt civilizations of the world and to unite all humanity under the single, peaceful rule of Tengri. This was not merely a political justification. It was the core of his worldview, a belief system that gave him a terrifying clarity of purpose. Every victory was not a personal triumph, but a confirmation of his divine mandate. Every defeat was a test from Tengri, a sign that he needed to be more ruthless, more disciplined. This psychology of triumph explains the sheer scale and ferocity of what was to come. When he looked at the walled cities of China or the opulent metropolises of Persia, he did not see centers of culture and learning. He saw hubs of corruption, weakness, and sin, places that resisted the divine will for unity. Therefore, their destruction was not just a military objective, it was a sacred duty, a form of righteous purification. This mindset removed all moral restraint. Pity, mercy, the preservation of art or life. These were irrelevant sentimentalities in the face of a divine mission. If a city resisted, its entire population could be exterminated without a second thought, because their resistance was a form of blasphemy. He saw his triumph not as the subjugation of peoples, but as the liberation of the world from chaos. The Yassa, his great law, would be imposed on everyone, and under its iron rule, a merchant could travel from one end of his empire to the other with a sack of gold on his head without fear. The price for this great peace was a sea of blood, but in his mind, it was a price worth paying. The moment of hubris on the mountaintop was the moment Genghis Khan granted himself permission to remake the world in his own image, no matter the cost. The final act in the unification of Mongolia was not a battle against a foreign enemy. but the tragic resolution of a deeply personal conflict. It was the last confrontation with his sworn brother, Jamuka, a moment that symbolized the death of the old steppe and the birth of the new Mongol nation. This was the saga of the death of his past. After the Kurultai, Jamuka was a man without a country, a fugitive leader of a lost cause. The aristocratic, traditionalist world he represented had been decisively defeated by Genghis Khan's new order of meritocracy and centralized power. For years, he wandered the fringes of the steppe, a ghost of a once great power. Finally, his own few remaining followers, seeking to curry favor with the new universal ruler, betrayed him. They captured him and brought him in chains before the Khan. The scene of their final meeting is one of the most poignant in the entire epic. Here were the two men who had started as blood brothers, who had fought together, ruled together, and dreamed together. Now one was the master of the world, and the other was a prisoner in rags. Genghis Khan, it is said, offered his old friend a pardon. He invited him to join him once more, to be his highest commander. But Jamuka, proud to the last, refused. He understood that his world was gone forever. There was no place for a man like him in the Khan's new, ruthlessly efficient state. He then made a final, fateful request. He asked for a noble death, a death befitting a Mongol chieftain, one without the spilling of blood, so that his spirit would not be trapped on earth. He asked that his back be broken. According to the secret history of the Mongols, he told his old friend, "As there can be only one sun in the sky, there can be only one master on earth." With this statement, he conceded the ideological battle that had defined their lives. Genghis Khan granted his request. The execution was carried out, and the life of his greatest rival, his only equal, his brother, was ended. But this was more than the elimination of an enemy. For the Khan, it was a profound, personal sacrifice. In killing Jamuka, he was killing a part of himself, the last vestiges of his own youth, the memory of the old, freer, more chaotic world he had both loved and destroyed. With Jamuka's death, the revolution was complete. There were no more rivals, no more alternative visions for the Mongol people. There was only the will of Genghis Khan. A great conqueror who only destroys is a mere footnote in history. A conqueror who builds a new world in the ruins of the old achieves immortality. With the steppe finally unified and all rivals eliminated, Genghis Khan turned from the arts of war to the even more challenging arts of nation building. This was the saga of creating a state from a horde. His vision was not simply to lead a collection of tribes on a grand raid, but to create a permanent, stable, and efficient empire. His reforms were as revolutionary and far-reaching as his military tactics. The cornerstone of this new nation was the Yassa, the great unwritten code of laws. While its exact contents are lost to history, its principles are well known. It was a code of absolute, draconian order imposed on a people who had known only lawlessness. Theft of livestock, the cause of countless tribal wars, was punishable by death. Adultery was punishable by death. Cowardice in battle was punishable by death. But the Yassa also contained progressive elements. It mandated religious tolerance for all, declaring that priests, doctors, and scholars of any faith were to be exempt from taxes and public service. It created a system of public hygiene and forbade the pollution of rivers. It was the legal foundation for a unified Mongol identity, transcending old clan loyalties. To administer this new nation, he needed a bureaucracy. He ordered the adoption of the Uyghur script to create a written Mongol language, allowing for the keeping of records, the transmission of orders, and the codification of laws. For the first time, the Mongol world was becoming a literate one. Perhaps his most brilliant practical innovation was the creation of the yam, an imperial postal system that was the envy of the world. A vast network of relay stations was established across the empire, each stocked with fresh horses and supplies. Riders carrying an imperial seal could travel at astonishing speeds, covering up to 200 miles a day, carrying intelligence, orders, and official correspondence. This system was the central nervous system of the empire, allowing the Khan to command and control a vast territory with unprecedented efficiency. He regularized weights and measures, promoted trade, and created a warrior aristocracy based not on birth, but on proven loyalty and skill in his service. He was not just a barbarian destroyer, he was a visionary state builder, laying the institutional foundations for an empire that would connect East and West and, for a brief, violent moment, unite the known world. No man, not even a universal ruler, is an island. The life of Genghis Khan was profoundly shaped by the powerful and often unseen influence of the people in his inner circle, particularly the women who formed the bedrock of his existence, and the sons whose rivalries would eventually tear his creation apart. This was the saga of his family, the heart of the empire. At the center of this world was his mother, Holun, a woman of incredible fortitude. She was the survivor who had held her starving family together after they were abandoned. She instilled in Temujin the will to endure, the hatred of chaos, and the fierce loyalty to kin that defined his early life. She was his first teacher in the brutal politics of survival, a constant source of counsel, and the unshakable moral core of his ascent. Equally important was his first and chief wife, Berta. Their bond, forged in the trauma of her abduction and rescue, was the emotional anchor of his life. She was not just a wife, but a trusted advisor whose counsel he sought and respected. Her status as his first wife ensured that her sons, and not the sons of his many other wives and concubines, would be his heirs, a decision that would have monumental consequences. It was these 4 sons, the so-called 4 steeds, who were both the pillars of his empire and the source of its greatest weakness. The eldest, Yoki, was a brilliant military commander, but his legitimacy was forever clouded by a dark secret. He was conceived during the time of Berta's captivity by the Merkits. Was he truly Genghis's son? This question of paternity created a deep and bitter rift with the second son, Chagatai, a stern, conservative man who considered himself the guardian of Mongol tradition and openly taunted Jochi as a Merkist bastard. The third son, Ogadei, was a charismatic and famously good-natured politician, a natural conciliator, and a heavy drinker, favored by his father for his ability to get along with his warring brothers. The youngest, Tolui, was a superb general, like his father, but also a follower, bound by tradition to inherit the Mongol heartland. The Khan saw the simmering hatred between his sons, especially between Yochi and Chagatai, and it filled him with dread. He knew that the personal animosity between them was more than a family squabble. It was a fault line running directly through the heart of his empire, a crack that threatened to shatter his life's work the moment he was gone. The transition from a regional power to a global empire is often triggered by a single, seemingly minor incident, a spark that ignites a world-consuming fire. For Genghis Khan and the Mongol Empire, that spark was the Otrar incident, a fatal miscalculation by a distant empire that knew nothing of the man it had just insulted. This was the saga of the Shah's arrogance. By the year 1218, the Mongol Empire had consolidated its control over the steppe and had conquered the Tangut Kingdom and much of the Jin Empire in northern China. Genghis Khan now sought to reopen and control the ancient Silk Road, not for conquest, but for commerce. He saw the immense wealth that could be gained from trade with the great Islamic powers to the west. The most powerful of these was the Khwarezmian Empire, ruled by Shah Muhammad II. From his capital in Samarkand, the Shah controlled a vast and wealthy territory, spanning modern-day Iran, Afghanistan, and Central Asia. Genghis Khan dispatched a trade caravan to the Khwarezmian frontier city of Otrar. The caravan was laden with precious goods and accompanied by some 450 merchants, mostly Muslims, along with Mongol envoys. It was a mission of peace and commerce. But Inalchuk, the governor of Otrar and an uncle of the Shah, saw things differently. Consumed by greed or paranoia, he accused the merchants of being spies. He ordered the entire caravan seized and all its members executed. One man managed to escape and brought the horrific news back to the Khan. Genghis Khan, a master of controlling his emotions, reacted with calculated diplomacy. He sent a second mission, this time of 3 envoys, directly to the Shah, demanding that the governor of Otrar be handed over for punishment and the stolen goods returned. It was a final chance for a peaceful resolution. Shah Muhammad, in an act of breathtaking arrogance and folly, made the worst decision of his life. He had the chief envoy executed and the other 2's beards shaved off, a sign of ultimate humiliation, and sent them back to the Khan. This was more than a political insult. It was a personal affront to Genghis Khan's divinely ordained authority. The murder of envoys was a violation of the most sacred laws of the steppe and a direct challenge to his honor. The chroniclers report that when he received the news, the Khan ascended a mountain, prayed to Tengri for 3 days, and descended with a vow of vengeance. The Shah, in his pride, had just signed the death warrant for his entire civilization. The world was about to pay the price for the governor's greed and the king's arrogance. There are wars, there are conquests, and then there are apocalyptic events that permanently alter the course of human history. The Mongol invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire was the latter. It was not a war in any conventional sense. It was a meticulously planned, brutally executed campaign of extermination, a whirlwind of destruction that erased one of the world's most brilliant civilizations from the map. This was the saga of the world in flames. In the year 1219, Genghis Khan unleashed his perfected war machine upon the unsuspecting West. The sensory assault of this invasion is almost beyond comprehension. The sound began as a distant rumble, the sound of hundreds of thousands of horses, a sound that grew into a terrifying, earth-shaking roar. The Mongol army, likely numbering between 100,000 and 150,000, did not attack as a single entity. In a brilliant strategic move, it split into multiple columns, appearing before different Khwarezmian cities simultaneously, creating an illusion of infinite numbers and paralyzing the Shah's command structure. The heart of the campaign was the sieges of the great Silk Road cities. Imagine the scene at Bukhara, a city known as the Dome of Islam, a center of learning and piety. The Mongols surrounded it. Their siege engineers captured Chinese experts, constructing terrifying new weapons, massive catapults that could hurl huge rocks, flaming pots of naphtha, and even diseased corpses over the walls. The noise was a constant, hellish cacophony of crashing stone, splintering wood, and the screams of the dying. When the walls were breached, the true horror began. The city's garrison was massacred. The civilian population was herded onto a plain outside the city. The artisans and skilled craftsmen were enslaved and sent back to Mongolia. The young women were taken as concubines. The rest of the population, men, women, children, were systematically slaughtered. The city was then looted and burned to the ground. The great library, with its countless priceless manuscripts, went up in smoke, its ashes blackening the sky for days. The same fate, or worse, befell Samarkand, Urgench, and a dozen other cities. The irrigation canals that had sustained life in this arid region for centuries were destroyed, turning fertile farmland back into desert. This was not conquest, it was erasure. The Khan was not just defeating an enemy, he was making an example of them, delivering a message of such absolute terror that no one would ever dare to defy the will of the Mongol Empire again. At the heart of the Khwarezmian catastrophe lies a fateful decision, a moment when military strategy was consumed by personal, obsessive rage. This was the psychological turning point, where a punitive expedition transformed into a campaign of near-genocidal extermination. This was the saga of the Khan's fury. The initial goal of the invasion was, at least in theory, strategic: to punish the Shah and neutralize a threat on the empire's border. But the war quickly became intensely personal. After the fall of the great cities, Shah Muhammad II fled, becoming a hunted fugitive. It was at this moment that Genghis Khan made a fateful and psychologically revealing decision. Instead of consolidating his gains, he unleashed his two greatest generals, Jebo and Subutai, with 20,000 elite cavalry on a mission with a single objective: to hunt down the Shah and bring him back, dead or alive. This was no longer about geopolitics. It was a vendetta. The pursuit of the Shah became one of the greatest and most destructive cavalry raids in history, a 2-year epic of terror that crossed thousands of miles. The fleeing Shah, panicked and powerless, could do nothing as the Mongol vanguard relentlessly closed in, destroying any city or army that stood in their way. The chase was a physical manifestation of the Khan's rage. He saw the Shah's flight not as a strategic retreat, but as an act of cowardice and defiance against his divine mandate. The refusal of the Shah to stand and fight was the ultimate insult, a denial of the Khan's right to mete out justice. This obsession permeated the entire Mongol high command. The war ceased to be a rational calculation of costs and benefits. The orders given to the troops became increasingly brutal. At the siege of Nishapur, after the Khan's son-in-law was killed by an arrow from the walls, the Khan's daughter allegedly requested that every living thing in the city, man, woman, child, and even the cats and dogs, be killed. The skulls of the dead were famously piled into massive pyramids. The error was not military. The campaign was a stunning success. The error was psychological. The Khan allowed his personal fury to dictate the scale of the destruction. He was not just conquering the Khwarezmian Empire, he was annihilating it, salting the earth so that nothing could grow again. In doing so, he cemented his legacy in the Islamic world, and by extension the West, not as a great conqueror or unifier, but as the scourge of God, a demonic force of pure destruction. This single-minded pursuit, born of insulted pride, would define his place in the memory of half the world. The empire that Genghis Khan had built was a paradox. It was the largest contiguous land empire in history, yet it was held together almost entirely by the singular will and terrifying reputation of one man. As the Khan entered his final years, the immense success of his conquests created a new and potentially fatal problem: the question of succession. This was the saga of the cracks in the foundation. The physical devastation of Central Asia was immense, but the political collapse was even more profound. The Mongols had destroyed the existing power structure, but had not yet fully built a stable replacement. The empire was vast, stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific, but its administration was still nascent. It was an empire built on fear and military might, and its stability depended entirely on the continued presence of its founder. As the Khan grew older, a palpable anxiety began to spread through the Mongol elite. Who could possibly follow him? The problem was embodied in the bitter, intractable rivalry between his 4 sons. The dispute between Yochi, the eldest of questionable parentage, and Chagatai, the rigid second son, had only deepened. Their open animosity was a constant threat to the unity of the royal family. At one famous and stormy council meeting, Chagatai publicly denounced Yochi in front of their father, shouting that he would never accept the rule of a Merkist bastard. The fight became so vicious that the Khan was forced to intervene, but the damage was done. The wound was mortal. Genghis Khan, the master of men who could command the loyalty of 1,000,000 warriors, could not command his own sons to love one another. Recognizing the danger, he made a pragmatic choice. He passed over both Yochi and Chagatai and designated his affable diplomatic third son, Ogedei, as his successor, a compromise candidate everyone could agree on. But this did not solve the underlying problem. He divided the empire into uluses, or administrative territories, for each of his sons, hoping to give them their own domains to rule. But this act of division, intended to prevent conflict, contained the seeds of the empire's future fragmentation. Just before the final campaign against the Tanguts, the crisis reached its peak when Yochi died under mysterious circumstances in his distant ulus. Did he die of an illness, or was he secretly assassinated on his father's orders for rumored disloyalty? The truth is unknown, but his death removed one half of the toxic rivalry, leaving a legacy of bitterness and suspicion that would haunt the empire for generations. The great conqueror had secured his borders against all external enemies, but he now faced the one enemy he could not defeat, the inevitable decay of his own creation from within. The end of a great epic often comes not with a thunderous climax, but with a quiet, ironic whisper. The man who had survived countless battles, who had stared down emperors and shahs, the man who had reshaped the map of the world with violence and will, did not meet his end in a blaze of glory. This was the saga of his final anticlimactic act. The year was 1227, during his final campaign, to utterly destroy the rebellious Tangut kingdom. The Khan was now in his 60s, an old man by the standards of the time, his body worn down by a lifetime of hardship and war. The official account, as recorded in the secret history, is deliberately mundane, almost absurdly so. During a winter hunt, his horse shied, throwing the great conqueror to the ground. He suffered internal injuries, and a high fever took hold. The master of the world's greatest cavalry, the ultimate horseman of the steppe, was undone by a simple fall from a horse. There are other theories, that he was killed in battle, died of typhus, or was assassinated by a captured Tangut princess. But the official version holds a deeper, more profound truth. The force of nature that was Genghis Khan was ultimately subject to the same banal accidents and bodily frailties as any common shepherd. The irony was cosmic. He lingered for months, his condition worsening, but he insisted the campaign continue. From his deathbed, he laid out the final strategy for the conquest of the Jin dynasty, his mind sharp and ruthless to the very end. His final order concerning the Tanguts was chilling. Their entire people, their root and seed, were to be exterminated for their treachery. He died in the summer, his passing kept a strict secret from the army to prevent a collapse in morale before the final victory was secured. His funeral procession was one of the strangest and most terrifying in history. His body was carried back to his sacred birthplace in Mongolia. According to legend, the funeral escort had orders to kill every person and every animal it encountered along the way, to ensure that the route to his final resting place would remain an eternal secret. He was buried in an unmarked grave, somewhere near the sacred mountain of Burkhan Khaldun. The precise location remains the greatest archaeological mystery in Asia. The man who had filled the world with his presence vanished from it without a trace, his tomb forever hidden, ensuring that the God Emperor would never be disturbed, and his final journey would remain, like his origins, shrouded in the mists of the vast, silent steppe. A man's life ends, but his story is eternal, constantly reinterpreted, rewritten, and fought over by subsequent generations. The legacy of Genghis Khan is not a single, settled narrative, but a fierce and ongoing conflict of interpretations, a battleground of irreconcilable truths. He is a historical Rorschach test, a figure so vast and consequential that what people see in him reveals more about themselves than it does about the man. This is the saga of his warring ghosts. In the collective memory of the West and the Islamic world, his name is synonymous with barbarism, a byword for wanton destruction and mass slaughter. He is the Antichrist on horseback, the scourge of God, who led a demonic horde out of the East to punish a sinful world. The chronicles of Persian, Arab, and European historians paint a vivid picture of pyramids of skulls, of rivers running red with blood, of flourishing civilizations reduced to dust. In this interpretation, he is the ultimate destroyer, a force of nature whose only legacy was a Mongol desert of death and ruin. But travel east, and the ghost changes its face. In China, he is known by his temple name, Yuan Taizu, the grand ancestor of the Yuan dynasty. While his conquest was brutal, he is officially framed as a legitimate and powerful unifier, a visionary who shattered a corrupt and divided China and laid the foundation for a new, powerful, and unified imperial state under his grandson, Kublai Khan. He is seen not as a foreign barbarian, but as the founder of a legitimate Chinese dynasty, a figure of immense historical strength. And then there is Mongolia itself. Here, he is not a conqueror or a dynasty founder. He is something far greater. He is Genghis Khan, the divine father of the nation, the man who took a collection of warring, insignificant tribes and forged them into a proud and unified people, giving them a name, a law, and a place in history. After centuries of suppression by Soviet authorities, who feared his nationalist symbolism, his image is now everywhere. He is on their currency, their vodka bottles, their central square. He is the eternal patriarchal spirit of Mongolia, a symbol of strength, unity, and national identity. So who was he? The butcher of nations, or the law-giving unifier? A demonic destroyer, or a visionary nation builder? The answer is that he was all of these things. His legacy is a profound and uncomfortable testament to the fact that history is not a simple story of good versus evil, and that the very same man can be both a god and a devil, depending on which side of his sword you are standing. So we return to the central question, the great paradox that lies at the heart of this epic. How did the shepherd, the outcast boy named Temujin, become the master of half the world? The final answer is not found in a single quality or event, but in a unique and unrepeatable confluence of man, moment, and method. He did not simply adapt to the world he was born into. He fundamentally rewrote its rules, weaponizing the very harshness that was meant to destroy him. This is the saga of solving the paradox. First, he turned personal suffering into a political ideology. The humiliation and chaos of his youth did not just make him strong, they gave him a vision. He saw the clan-based system of the steppe not as a culture to be preserved, but as a disease to be cured. His obsession with order was not an abstract philosophy. It was a visceral reaction to the trauma of his own life. He weaponized his pain. Second, he replaced the aristocracy of blood with an aristocracy of merit. This was his most revolutionary idea. In a world governed by who your father was, he created a system where the only thing that mattered was what you could do. A shepherd could become a general, A captive could become a trusted advisor. This unleashed a torrent of human potential. Ambitious, talented men from every walk of life flocked to his banner because he offered them something no other leader did: a future based on their own abilities, not their birth. This created an army and an administration that was more skilled, more loyal, and more motivated than any of its rivals. Third, he perfected the art of unified, disciplined warfare. He took the traditional Mongol skills of horsemanship and archery and fused them with an iron discipline, a sophisticated command structure, and a brilliant use of intelligence and psychological terror. The Mongol army under his command was not a horde. It was a complex, integrated weapon system, the most advanced of its time. Finally, and most crucially, he unleashed this perfectly honed instrument of meritocratic, disciplined violence upon a world that was fractured, complacent, and corrupt. The great sedentary empires of his time, from the Jin to the Khwarezmian, were internally divided, ruled by arrogant elites who fatally underestimated the barbarians at their gates. They were rich and powerful, but they were brittle. Genghis Khan did not just defeat them, he shattered their entire reality. The shepherd conquered the world because he recognized that the world was broken, and he had forged himself and his people into the perfect tool to break it further, so that it could be remade in his own image. In the final verdict of history, the saga of Genghis Khan transcends the story of a single man or a single empire. It becomes a universal, timeless lesson on the fundamental relationship between chaos and order, civilization and the forces that lie beyond its fragile walls. His life is the ultimate testament to the terrifying, world-altering power that can be unleashed when a singular, focused will, forged in the crucible of absolute nothingness, is imposed upon a fractured world. He represents the eternal archetype of the outsider, the man from the periphery who brings down the citadels of the center. He demonstrated that established power, no matter how ancient or seemingly secure, is always vulnerable to a new idea, especially when that idea is backed by overwhelming and ruthlessly applied force. His story is a chilling reminder that the intricate structures of civilization, our laws, our cities, our philosophies, are a thin veneer, easily scraped away by a leader who operates outside of its moral conventions and is willing to pay any price in blood to achieve his vision. He proved that a nation is not a thing of blood or soil, but an idea, a shared discipline. He took a people with no written language, no cities, and no institutional memory, and, through sheer force of will, gave them the most powerful state on earth. But his legacy is also a profound warning about the nature of order itself. The Pax Mongolica, the great peace his conquests eventually established, which reconnected East and West and allowed for an unprecedented flow of goods, ideas, and technologies, was bought at an almost unimaginable cost. It raises the eternal question: can a just and orderly world be built upon a foundation of atrocity? Is a peace enforced by terror truly peace? The life of Genghis Khan does not provide an easy answer. Instead, it stands as a monument to a terrifying truth, that the same forces that create order can be indistinguishable from the forces of destruction, and that history is often written not by the righteous or the good, but by those with the will to burn the old world down to make way for the new. The final frame is not of a man, but of a shadow. It is a long shadow, stretching across 8 centuries and half the globe. To see it, we must zoom out, far beyond the battlefields and the burning cities, beyond the steppes of Mongolia, until the earth itself becomes a marbled sphere below. From this vantage point, we can see the world he made. We see the faint, indelible lines of the Silk Road, the great artery of commerce and culture, that his empire secured and revitalized, a conduit through which everything from gunpowder to paper money, from Marco Polo's stories to the Black Death, would travel from east to west, forever binding the destinies of continents. We see the borders of modern nations, China, Russia, Iran, whose modern shapes and historical trajectories were profoundly, violently carved out by the Mongol conquests and the subsequent fragmentation of his empire. We can even see his legacy in our own DNA. Modern genetic studies have shown that a startling percentage of the male population across a vast swathe of Asia, perhaps as many as 16 million men today, carry a Y chromosome that can be traced back to him and his family. He altered not just the political map, but the very genetic landscape of humanity. The man himself is gone, his body returned to the earth in a secret grave. But the shepherd from the banks of the Onan River achieved a kind of brutal, undeniable immortality. The forces he unleashed, of global communication, of biological exchange, of the violent clash and fusion of civilizations, continue to shape our world in ways we can barely comprehend. The fire he lit over 800 years ago has long since burned out, but its heat can still be felt. The shepherd became the master of half the world, and in doing so, he became an ancestor to us all. His shadow lingers,